Hi, I'm Jim, and I want to share my story. Sometimes when you're content, you might overlook what's really happening around you, but then unexpectedly you discover that your wife is having an affair and your world turns dark. JT and I are both members of a beer club in Atlanta. He recently revealed that his wife of 25 years have been cheating on him for over 24 years. One piece of advice he gave to the group, which I ignored, was to take your rose-colored glasses off and examine your own marriage. My wife Karen and I have been married for almost 28 years. We have 3 children. Life was good. My wife Karen is the only child of Ben and Alex. They are a wealthy and well-known family. Although she's 49, she could easily pass for 35. I would describe my upbringing as middle class and raised in a loving family. I'm from a small town near Atlanta. I'm the younger of 2 boys, and we grew up next door to my grandparents. My father worked at my grandfather's hardware store. My brother and I helped out after school and on weekends. His name was Ken. Ken went on to attend Georgia Tech and is now an electrical engineer in South Carolina. Following in my brother's footsteps, I also attended Georgia Tech as a computer science major. I had a best friend named Joey. We have been best friends since we were 3 years old. While I attended Georgia Tech, Joey went to Emory. We often set each other up on dates from each other's college. One time when I visited his college, he set me up with Karen for a blind date. Out of all those women, she was the only one I called for a second date. As seniors, we spent as much time together as our schedules allowed. One thing I knew for sure was that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with Karen. However, there was one issue I needed to address before proposing. I was raised to work hard and provide for my family, but Karen came from a wealthy background and had never worked a day in her life. I couldn't bring myself to rely on her parents' assistance. Fortunately, she agreed to marry me and we embarked on our journey as an independent couple. I had saved a part of my earnings to buy Karen an engagement ring. The day after I proposed to Karen, we shared the news with her parents. Karen and her mother were thrilled and immediately began planning the wedding. Karen's father pulled me aside and asked me to speak in his study. We had a conversation about my career plans after graduation. I informed him that I had accepted a job with a large corporation in Atlanta, which seemed to please him. He was acquainted with the company's executives. After spending about 2 hours together, we said our goodbyes. Over the next 14 months, Karen and her mother organized for the wedding. I focused on improving my career. 3 months after we shared our plans with Karen's parents, her father invited me into his study again. He expressed his fondness for me and acknowledged Karen's love for me. However, as a father, he felt the need to protect his daughter and family. I sat there puzzled about what he was getting at. He handed me a document explaining that it was a prenuptial agreement. He wanted me to sign it. I could hear my father's voice echoing in my head advising me never to sign anything without reading it thoroughly and asking questions. My father also advised me to seek advice before signing a contract. I gave the contract a careful look though. I took my time reading it. My future father-in-law was very patiently waiting as I continued to read. The document stipulated that if our marriage ended within the first 5 years, I would receive $100,000 but wouldn't be entitled to any other assets from Karen's family. Every 10 years, the monetary limits would increase with the maximum reaching $5 million on our 25th wedding anniversary. I sat there dumbfounded, trying to figure out how to respond. After a few minutes, I addressed him saying, "Sir, I love your daughter and plan to spend the rest of my life loving her. However, the practical side of me understands your perspective. I'll take this with me and think it over." He nodded and replied, "Good. I'll wait for your response." My father has always been my go-to person for advice, so I visited him the next day. He meticulously read through the document twice before offering his thoughts. He said, "Jim, we both understand why Ben wants this agreement, and the way it's written it primarily protects his family's interests. The real question is, what do you want out of this marriage, and what do you want to safeguard for yourself?" We delved into my aspirations and dreams. We also talked about my long-term vision with Karen. My dad continued, "I've always believed that if someone asked you to make sacrifices, they should be willing to make some as well. Ben's attorney is representing the Thompsons' interests, as he's paid to do. They might see you as a country boy with less to lose and more to gain. Both you and I can understand the reasoning behind this agreement. Ben may believe you love Karen now, but he's concerned about unforeseen developments down the road. If we were in his shoes, we might do the same." He paused, then added, "Marriages can falter for various reasons. This prenuptial covers any possible reason. Being together in college is one thing, but being a married working couple is another. Can you and Karen overcome challenges that may arise, such as differences in jobs, friends, finances, or family dynamics. Would you ever want Ben's money because your marriage didn't work out? I'm grateful I discussed this with Dad. I also consulted my brother, who provided similar advice. After talking with several other trusted individuals, I knew the changes I needed to make to the prenuptial agreement and how to discuss them with Ben. During my next visit to Karen's family home, I approached Ben for a private conversation. We moved to his study away from the wedding preparations. It was there that I brought up the prenuptial agreement. I explained to Ben that after careful consideration, I had some proposed changes to the agreement. He listened attentively and encouraged me to go on. Here's what I suggested. After the first 10 years of our marriage, he would contribute $100,000 to an investment account. We would jointly control investment decisions and review them quarterly. I believe this would strengthen our bond. If our marriage ever ended in divorce, he would retain the money. Any assets acquired by Karen and me during our marriage would be split evenly, except for gifts or inheritances from our parents. In the event that our marriage ended due to my betrayal, Ben would keep the funds while Karen would inherit all marital assets, excluding gifts from out families. If Karen would be unfaithful, the funds would belong to me and I would claim all marital assets again, excluding any family gifts. When we reached our 43rd wedding anniversary, control of the investment account would transition to both Karen and me. I gave Ben some time to think over these terms. He seemed relaxed and expressed his gratitude for the sentiment behind my proposals. He particularly liked the idea of the joint investment, but had questions about the significance of the 43-year mark and the inclusion of infidelity clauses. I explained that at 43 years, Karen and I would both be 65. That age often is associated with retirement. Regarding the infidelity clauses, I clarified that while irreconcilable differences could lead to a divorce without blame, adultery represented a deep breach of trust, something I believe the marriage could not recover from. Ben understood my perspective and promised to draft a revised version of the agreement. A couple of weeks later, Karen was informed about the updated prenuptial terms. While initially surprised, she came to appreciate the thoughtfulness. After a thorough review, she asked for my thoughts on the agreement. I confirmed my comfort with these stipulations and reiterated my reasons for them, especially emphasizing the emotional weight of adultery. Following this, Karen and I celebrated our love with a magnificent wedding followed by an unforgettable honeymoon. Now for my first update. We've been married for nearly 28 years and have 3 children. Our oldest, Dan, is 26 and named after my father. He is working for one of Dan's companies. Ben is grooming him to take over. He's also been accepted into an MBA program starting this fall. Benny, who is 25, has a passion for the outdoors and joined my dad after graduating from college. As you can see, Benny is named after Karen's father. My dad is delighted to have family members taking over the farm and hardware store. My brother and I left the farm as soon as we could. Amy, our youngest, turned 18 3 months ago and has me wrapped around her little finger. She's our most talented athlete and is receiving a full scholarship to play soccer at UNC next year. After our boys left for college, I converted the basement game room into a brew pub. Karen and I enjoy hosting gatherings. For the past few months, I had felt that someone might be pilfering my beer. I never maintained a strict record, but there was an uneasy feeling in my gut as I was organizing. I was getting ready for a beer club gathering and I found myself short of IPA bottles. During the meeting, talked to Fred about my growing suspicion regarding my 18-year-old daughter possibly taking my beer from the pub. He inquired if I allowed my daughter to consume beer. I explained that while I did allow her sip if she was interested, I couldn't imagine her taking whole bottles. I further expressed my observations that the beer tended to vanish whenever I was away on trips. I was sure it wasn't Karen since I had never seen her completely drink a beer, giving her preference for wine. While my sons enjoyed my brew, they always left with a case of their own. This led me to believe Amy and her friends was a culprits. To this, Fred suggested installing a motion-activated camera in the pub to potentially catch her red-handed. Impressed by the idea, I inquired if he could set it up the following morning when Amy would be at school. He proposed 11 a.m. as a suitable time. I agreed. He got the system up and running in 15 minutes. He also took some extra time to guide me on its operation. He wondered if I intended to inform Karen about the surveillance setup. I said no, as she would let it slip to Amy. He was curious about my travel plans and I shared that I was scheduled to visit Cleveland the next week. Before partying, he wished me well and hoped the system would provide the evidence I was looking for. With everything in place, we left the pub and decided to grab some lunch. Over the next 2 weeks, I made it a routine to enjoy a beer in my pub while checking the surveillance tape. However, All I ever saw was a cleaning crew who came in on Tuesdays and Fridays along with myself returning from my Cleveland trip. I had to spend the day at the office. In the evening, Karen and I had dinner with her parents and attended a play. On Saturday, we hosted a barbecue at our house. Sunday, after attending church, we visited my parents. When we returned home, I decided to take a nap in my easy chair. On Monday night, while Karen was at a meeting and Amy was at soccer practice, I forced myself to check out the tape. 5 minutes into watching the footage, my world shattered. I had expected to see Amy and her friends, but instead I witnessed Karen entering my pub hand in hand with Jerome. Jerome, along with his wife Diana and daughter, had moved into our neighborhood about 8 months ago. His daughter Nicole had quickly become friends with Amy. As I watched, I saw my wife bend over the arm of my favorite chair while Jerome was intimately having his way with her. I sat there numb and in shock. It wasn't until I realized I was watching footage from the Saturday barbecue that I snapped out of it. I deeply regretted not installing audio. The initial shock I felt soon gave way to anger, which then escalated to pure rage. I remembered my father's consistent advice about tackling problems with a level head, cautioning against making decisions in the heat of anger. He had often emphasized doing thorough research and understanding the crux of the issue, then decide on the course of action. He believed that decisions made in anger were often regrettable. Knowing this, I was determined to gather irrefutable evidence. As I waited for the tape to rewind, I tried to control my emotions by taking deep breaths. I braced myself for another viewing of the distressing footage. It was clear from their interactions that this wasn't a one-time occurrence. The sequence showed them sharing a beer and engaging in a casual conversation. When he finished a beer, Karen got up and got him another. She never treated me like that. Not only had he deceived me by getting involved with my wife, but he also had the audacity to drink my beer and even take some bottles with him. I decided to consult Frank and gave him a call. I asked if he had a moment to speak about who was stealing my beer. He asked if I had caught my daughter. I corrected him and told him that the tape had revealed my wife with our neighbor. I gave him the explicit details and expressed my need for his expert advice. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, Frank conveyed his sympathies and inquired about what I specifically needed. I told him I needed comprehensive assistance. We planned a meeting for the next day at 4 p.m. To my relief, Karen hadn't returned home yet, giving me some time to compose myself. About an hour into my reflection, Amy approached me, and I took a moment to reassure her that I would be there for her soccer match. I don't typically avoid problems, so I chose to stay awake and wait for my unfaithful wife to return home. I can't help but wonder if she was actually at a meeting that night or if she was involved with someone else. Regardless, I figured Frank would uncover the truth. I entered Frank's office at 3:55, mentally prepared for what was about to happen. Frank expressed his sympathy regarding Karen's betrayal. I asked Frank for his professional advice, making it clear that I was aware of the prenuptial agreement and stressing that we had all the necessary evidence to prove adultery. I was eager to know his strategy and very determined to gather comprehensive information about Jerome, his background, connections, and family. I wanted him to be closely monitored in every aspect of his life, as I was determined to make him face the consequences for disrupting my life. Of course, my intentions extended to Karen, and I wanted her to be under continuous surveillance. Frank acknowledged the extensive nature of this task and explained that it would require a significant amount of time and manpower. He assured me that the process would begin the very next day and suggested installing surveillance equipment in my home and Karen's vehicle. I thought that was a good idea. I expressed regret for not having audio recording from the previous week. Frank reminded me of my upcoming trip scheduled for 3 weeks from that day. He was confident that by the time I returned, a substantial amount of information would have been collected. When he inquired about the tape, I confirmed that I had brought everything he had specified. When we discussed the logistics of installing the surveillance system, I mentioned that Karen had her regular bridge game on Thursdays. This could be a possible opportunity for the installation. When I asked about the time required, I was informed that it would take about 2 hours. We agreed to meet at my house the following Thursday at 9:30. As I left Frank's office, I felt a slight sense of relief knowing that proactive measures were being put in place. The 3-week wait was torture. I hated faking being normal but put on. When it finally came to an end and I fake set off for Austin, I had a feeling that it was my final goodbye to Karen. Mike and Frank had meticulously prepared all the necessary legal documents which were securely stored in my briefcase. Now ready for the upcoming confrontation, I changed my destination from Austin to JT's place, fully aware that the following day would mark the end of my marriage. As expected, Frank later gave me the troubling news I had mentally prepared for. He told me that shortly after I left, that man had come to my house. They had engaged in their secret affair right in our bed. To make matters worse, Karen asked him to come the next day as well. After a lot of thinking, I decided how to handle Karen's infidelity. Although a part of me wanted to confront them in a dramatic fashion, I chose the more measured approach. The next day, I reached out to Karen's father asking for a private meeting at his office to discuss an important matter. Recognizing the seriousness of my request, he agreed to see me that evening at 6:30. When I arrived, he looked puzzled. I began by expressing my deep respect for him, liking it to the respect one has for a father. I then explained my situation, revealing my intention to serve Karen with divorce papers due to her adultery. Shocked, he asked for more details, so I told him the painful truth. I had obtained video evidence of Karen's affair with her lover right in our marital bed. To emphasize the seriousness of the situation, I added that even at that moment they were repeating their actions. He was visibly shaken and wanted to know my next steps. I shared my initial desire to confront them dramatically at our home, but then suggested a more restrained approach, mainly out of respect for him. Over the next 45 minutes, we discussed my proposed plan, and we eventually agreed that it was the most sensible way to proceed. At 9:15, Ben and I convened in my residence, joined by Frank, Brad, Mike, and Steve, an Atlanta police detective. Following the introductions, Frank updated us on the situation unfolding in the master bedroom. Karen and her lover were indiscreetly involved right now. As we exchanged words on the porch, Frank was alerted by his earpiece about the ongoing intimacy within. Upon gaining entry into the living room, I turned my attention to Ben. I suggest you stay downstairs given the circumstances. It was a delicate situation considering his relationship to Karen. As our group proceeded upstairs, Brad, equipped with a video camera, led the way. The intention was to capture undeniable evidence before confronting them. We aligned outside the bedroom. The muffled sounds of intimacy emanating from within gave us a brief pause. It was clear they were sharing more than just a physical connection. Preparing ourselves, we made our entrance into what was my marital bedroom. The sight that greeted us was Karen attempting modesty by covering herself with a sheet. Jerome rather ineffectively used a pillow as a shield of his member. Without wasting any time, I begin the introductions. Frank, the investigator. Mike, my attorney of the impending divorce. Steve and Brad for camera and audio. The atmosphere was heavy as I explained my restraint from violence. I made it abundantly clear that our home had been under surveillance for weeks. We had captured everything. She tried to interject, but I told her to shut up and listen. I laid bare my knowledge of her past with Jerome and her motives for marrying me. The room's tension intensified as I recounted how she had chosen me over Jerome. I was presentable to her parents. They would never have accepted Jerome into their family. I also ensured the continuity of the family line, a purpose now fulfilled with 3 heirs. As Karen attempted to interject again, I silenced her, emphasizing the pointlessness of her explanation. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Especially damning was her invitation to Jerome not long after my departure. Turning my focus to Jerome, noting his impressive skill at deceit, I related how he had been closely watched for the last few weeks. I spoke of a comprehensive report about his background and activities. To further the humiliation, I instructed Frank to display the findings on the DVD for the pair. It first revealed that Karen was not Jerome's only side piece. It displayed him intimately involved with 2 other women. The climax of the video was a recent dining scene where Jerome openly discussed his affairs with his friends and boasted about continuing his affairs with married women. He specifically mentioned Karen. He reminisced about Karen visiting him on our wedding day. He boasted how she promised to remain faithful to her husband and how they had what was supposed to be one final sexual encounter. He scornfully remembered how she had recently confessed a desire to marry him and expressed doubts about ever considering marrying her. The impact of these revelations was immediate. Jerome became furious. Karen was a mess and overwhelmed with emotion. She was curled into herself, tears streaming down her face. Sensing the tension, Frank and Steve positioned themselves closer to Jerome, trying to calm the situation. They assured him they meant no harm unless provoked. I hinted at Jerome's wife and her brothers being displeased upon discovering his infidelity. I suggested he get dressed quickly, as I then informed Jerome that his past actions were now known to everyone. Evidence had been given to his wife and the husbands of the other 2 women. Furious, Jerome threatened me, unaware that he had just incriminated himself in front of a lawyer and a police officer. Mike handed Jerome a set of documents, divorce papers from his wife. I conveyed his wife's strong desire for Jerome to never enter their home again. In a surprising twist, I told Jerome about his brothers-in-law who were already waiting downstairs to escort him out. He was clearly not in a pleasant mood. As Steve led Jerome away, I turned my attention to Karen. I challenged her to consider the magnitude of her betrayal. How did it feel knowing she was just another conquest for Jerome? What was it like to come to terms with the fact that she had destroyed our family? She hadn't just ended our marriage, she had cast a dark shadow over every cherished memory and future family event in the eyes of our children, our parents, and our friends. Her actions made her a deceiver. Seeing her now filled me with visceral disgust. It pained me to think that I had devoted 30 years to someone so undeserving. She appeared pitiful, tears streaming down her face. I informed her that I no longer considered you worth my time and urged her to get dressed quickly. Her father was waiting downstairs, and he wasn't thrilled about discussing her actions with Alice. I emphasized that I had nothing more to say to her and urged her to hurry. When she expressed reluctance to let her father see her in her current revealing outfit, I reminded her that she had the choice to change quickly or be taken downstairs as she was. She asked for a different outfit, but I stood firm. Her complaints about privacy were met with a reminder that those present had already seen much more compromising footage of her. In her high heels, I escorted her downstairs. The attire put shock on Ben's face. He couldn't believe his eyes and expressed concerns about taking her home looking like that. Worried about both Alice's and his own reactions, I was torn. I wanted her to feel the embarrassment of her clothing choice, but I also respected Ben and Alice. As the weight of the decision hung in the air, only the steady ticking of the grandfather clock broke the silence. Understanding Ben's discomfort, I offered a compromise. Steve could drive them home in Ben's vehicle and I would follow behind later in his. As the weight of the decision hung in the air, only the steady ticking of the grandfather clock broke the silence. Understanding Ben's discomfort, I offered a compromise. Steve could drive them home in Ben's vehicle and I would follow behind later in his. As a final sign of respect for Karen's parents, I allowed her a brief opportunity to change her clothes. She wasted no time going upstairs and returned shortly after wearing an outfit that was far more modest, resembling that of a typical mother. Before she departed, I approached her and removed her engagement and wedding rings. I stated that she didn't deserve them. When she tried to take her purse, I stopped her, insisting she would leave with only the clothes she was wearing. The confrontation with my wife and Jerome was over, but that pain did not compare to telling the children about their mother's affair. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. Seeing the pain in their eyes, answering their questions, and witnessing them cope with their mother's infidelity was heartbreaking. When Karen cheated on me, she also cheated on our family. My parents' reaction mirrored that of my children's. This will be my final update. Amy turned down her soccer scholarship from North Carolina to join the Emory soccer team. She wanted to be closer to her daddy, but I insisted she live on campus with her teammates. She helped me remodel the master bedroom and purchase new furniture for my pub. When she's not home, I sleep in the guest room. Dan and Benny visit and check on me more frequently than before. One of the things I enjoyed the most is that they take turns accompanying me to my beer club meetings. We're organizing a competition to determine who can brew the best beer using Benny's hops. I'm aware that Amy keeps an eye on me and ensures her brothers stay in touch with me, following advice from our attorneys. Karen and I opted for a no-fault divorce. We agreed that I had sufficient evidence of Karen's adultery. We decided that there was no need to file for divorce on grounds of adultery to gain control of the investment fund for the prenuptial agreement. This way, Ben, Alice, and Karen avoided the embarrassment of a public trial. I did permit Ben and Alice to go through Karen's belongings a couple of months after the incident. Later, Ben got in touch with me wanting to have a face-to-face conversation at his office. This was a bit surprising since Ben and I usually just did phone chats. For nearly 25 years, he had been trying to get me involved in their family business. I had consistently declined his offers, always emphasizing my desire to make my own way rather than relying on his success. However, during this meeting, Ben brought up the idea of me joining the family business again. I quickly let him know I wasn't interested, reminding him of my long-standing stance on the matter. Ben understood my previous situation, but this time was different. He mentioned his age and the fact that my son Dan wasn't ready to take over. He believed that he would be ready in another 10 years. He wanted me to step in temporarily until Dan was ready. He also talked about how Karen's actions had deeply affected his wife, Alice. She felt humiliated and had withdrawn from her social circle. Her therapist recommended the change of environment for her well-being. Given all this, Ben expressed his wish for me to temporarily take over his role and mentor Dan for the future. I expressed my sympathy for Alice's situation and asked him to pass on my feelings to her. I also told him that I couldn't give him a definite answer right away and needed some time to think it over. He understood but was eager to speed up the decision-making process for Alice and Karen's sake. He asked for a time frame for my decision, and I agreed to meet again in 3 days. Before we wrapped up the conversation, he playfully mentioned my habit of consulting with my father for major decisions. 3 days later, I let Ben know that I'd be accepting his offer. Dan is excited about his role in overseeing the family business. Ben has rightly pointed out that Dan still is a few years away from being ready to take over. Ben and I meet with Dan once a month to discuss family business matters. This arrangement allows Ben to stay updated on what's happening, and it provides Dan with the support system he can turn to for advice. Karen moved to Florida with her parents and stays in touch with the children. Dan and Benny make several trips to Florida each year to visit Karen. Amy spends a couple of weeks with her during the summer. Karen also attends several of Amy's soccer games but keeps her distance from me. Alice is making progress but won't be returning to Atlanta. I'm not sure what happened to Jerome. His wife divorced him, and to the best of my knowledge, he relocated out west. He was involved in at least 8 divorce cases and is financially ruined. Jerome not only ruined his own life but also destroyed many marriages. I suppose I shouldn't place all the blame on him. Those women made the choice to cheat on their husbands. They were not coerced. They planned their affairs in advance and share responsibility with Jerome. I hope to find someone to love in the future. I miss being married and having someone to hold and talk to. Until I find love again, I'll wake up each morning, express gratitude for my children, and approach life with the forward-looking perspective rather than dwelling on the past. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Please take the time to subscribe to the channel. It's a small thing for you, but means so much to the TDG team. Thank you.